Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the new double album from Kendrick Lamar, Mr. Morale, and the Big Steppers. 5 years ago, when I reviewed Damn by Kendrick Lamar, I opened up the conversation by talking about the review-proof album, where regardless of what I or any other critic would say, everyone would have already bought and heard the project and had an opinion well established. And 5 years later, I can look back on all of that and realize that while it is a description that remains true for certain artists, you can go deeper to really peel apart the implications of all of it. The most obvious being that reviews function as a consumer's guide, and they're designed to impact purchases. I barely believed that at the time, but with the accessibility of streaming where anyone can hear anything if they've got the time, a review should function more as a defined, explained opinion than advice to serve the music industry's marketing arm. But let's go a little deeper. Why do certain mainstream tentpole acts feel so review-proof, where that definition has shifted in the era of social media, where the die-hard fans will call something a classic without even hearing the project, where they will tear down your throat if you express critiques of even flaws the act might highlight themselves, if it might seem like you're potentially undermining their senpai's platform. Now, in music criticism, this phenomenon is nowhere near as bad as, say, movies or video games, mostly because music taste feels so widely varied and decentralized. But you wouldn't always know that looking at certain mainstream publications that just love to entrench a cast of artists as worthy of the highest acclaim, undeserving of any reproach. And if the stands just so happen to give them all the clicks and traffic along the way, well, that's just a happy accident, right? And the ugly truth? The industry feeds into this at every single term. They prime the pump, they inflate these cults of personality, where the artists who are backed by the label machine receive the propaganda and the hype cycle. And in an era where commercial success is often correlated with critical acclaim in the eyes of the general public, more often than not, it works. As much as certain individual critics want to push back against all of this, when I list off a series of rap acts that I think are comparable to Kendrick Lamar in every year that he's dropped, and I get a request for their album's Metacritic scores for some demand of consensus, when most of those acts don't have the marketing or the attention to get widely covered in Metacritic? Look, I want to say that that's the exception to the rule, but I know it's not. And as much as I'd like to distance myself from some of this, I got rid of scores this year. I've been leaning more into comprehensive discussion with my long-form coverage. I've been trying to facilitate more conversation rather than feed into the validation that so many seek out when they look for reviews. I can't deny that by just giving Kendrick Lamar the prioritized solo review, I am feeding into all that assigned importance by the industry. And this is where I could talk about platforms and power structures, where power is concentrated, given, and received in the information economy. Hell, I could highlight how you don't really take power on social media so much as you're given it, and it can be so easily taken from you, which is a lot more intangible in comparison with the traditional institutions that aren't really used to this dynamic and really want all of you to shut up and consume, except it's very tangible for those who don't have a voice anywhere else, or those who have to use that voice in order to thrive in the modern era. I can highlight how it's all engineered on the platforms to prey on emotions and convenience, where the default state is not the free marketplace of ideas full of all the reasoned critique. I mean, that's hard. Abuse is easy, and those who know how to manipulate and market through this system can amplify all of it, including the architects of the platforms themselves, who are often way over their heads with all the centralized powers that they have enabled, especially as it then spills over to tangible and increasingly violent real-world activity. And this is all assuming actors who are operating in good faith, and it's often hardly that. It's mainlining confirmation bias, where you believe what you want to believe or what you fear to believe, especially in times of crisis. So what happens if you've been granted power, not just on these online platforms, but culture at large, and not just in entertainment where you might have made millions, but in connection to social causes addressing systemic inequality, where your art has galvanized a movement? And yet when things seem to be at their bleakest, you seem to be a ghost. And you might think that I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I bring all this up because if you know Kendrick Lamar's music, he has been interrogating these systems of power for years now in his art, sometimes framing himself in more of a leadership role hoisted upon him by transcendent artistic skill and a record label that's easy and eager to commodify it. We'll come back to that. But more often than not, as someone who is trapped within that same system. Good Kid, Mad City was a street-level snapshot of a day in that life. To Pimp a Butterfly blew it up to a national, historic scale with that context, but also didn't shy away from the crushing weight of perceived leadership and perceived hypocrisy when it came to living within that culture as he tries to hold to his morals, constantly struggling to be a good person and crushed under the weight of trying to be a better person. And that would be tested to the absolute limit on Damn. Arguably his commercial peak, if you're looking for irony, but also where it felt like he was all too aware of all of it, where he was recoiling from it all, acutely aware of his own human limitations and the expectations of a world that would demand everything from him but never offer him that prayer. It makes sense that he might be drawn to the black utopian curation of Black Panther, but also that he might disappear from the limelight in the years to come, where despite his absence, the expectations just kept going up through the roof. Now, some of it was the acknowledgement that this would be his last album with Top Dog Entertainment, aka TDE, but I'd argue it goes a little deeper. As much as Kendrick Lamar seems to have abhorred the label while reaping all the benefits and the acclaim of it, he has been a leadership figure not just in rap music but hip-hop culture at large. Power that he's been given whether he's wanted it or not, especially in the face of peers who are not holding up all that well under similar pressure and the graphic violence that has erupted in recent years thanks to blurred boundaries of power in an economically unstable world further pushed to the brink thanks to 2 years of plague. After all, Kendrick Lamar has shown that he could do so much with all of that power that the world's given him with all those big ideas. So what did we get from the hotly anticipated Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers? I'm going to start all this off with a big disclaimer. This review is going to run very long, hell, the intro was long as balls, and I'm going to be very harsh in some of my critiques of this project, specifically in themes and some of the ideas it's exploring. This does not mean that I think the album is bad. Kendrick Lamar made a pretty interesting album, but his execution is pretty solid in realizing that vision. I'm going to give him a lot of credit for it. However, with the high standards that Kendrick Lamar has earned comes a sort of in-depth and complicated analysis that does not allow this album to get the unabashed praise for just getting in the door. And given just how confrontational a lot of this album is in its conversation, to do my due diligence, I feel I at least have to come with some of the same energy. As it is, I would argue this is close to the least commercial album Kendrick Lamar has ever made, absolutely on purpose, and we'll get to the implications of all that. And it's not meant to be easy, especially to the mainstream public who might not be as accustomed to having to do this much work to decode the message and then deal with the message, which is why it's getting some mixed reviews in certain quarters. I have no problem with Kendrick Lamar making this difficult, especially as just this year I could argue that Billy Woods made a much tougher album to untangle and grapple with, and Kendrick Lamar has been setting this up as a culmination of moral quandaries in his art for years now. But just because the execution might be impressive in its complexity and scope does not mean he always sticks the landing. And that makes Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers a fascinating but flawed release, and not one I would put among his best. In fact, more often than not, I would struggle to call this great. So yeah, if you want a review in a nutshell, it's that. I got a lot more to say. Strap in. So, you know what? Let's start with the execution of the album, from Kendrick Lamar himself to the production. Because on the one hand, you could describe this project as less commercial, but that's often a way to sidestep how a project doesn't have strong hooks or a lot of structure. And where in the latter case, there is a lot of deliberate internal structure knitting the project together, I don't think this album has a single hook that matches what Kendrick Lamar has delivered at his best, especially when it comes to the bangers that have been his festival festival staples. Now, that's not always been in Kendrick Lamar's wheelhouse, to be fair. Untitled Unmastered didn't have much in the way of hooks at all, and that was still pretty great, to say nothing of To Pimp a Butterfly and some of its left field elements. But let's be real, that album's uncommercial side came with embracing a lot of jazz textures and its sheer immense density to process, and it still had workable singles that were pretty great. And let's not compare a compilation of performance freestyles to a hotly anticipated double album where the production is relatively accessible, and the songs themselves don't always feel as sticky or potent as they could, closer to the very agreeable mid-tempo vibe to the tones on that Black Panther soundtrack that, I gotta be honest, were never that impressive for me. Instead, for instance, we get the tinkling Die Hard with Blast Hook and Amanda Reefer's post-chorus that has a gentle R&B bounce, but not much else. Or the more textured warble of Purple Hearts with Summer Walker that might have the best Ghostface Killah verse I have heard in a long time. But outside of that, it's not that impressive, really, from a production standpoint. What else do you even have for the crossover single? I kind of get why songs like this are here. In fact, what becomes a lot more alarming is how a lot of the instrumentals are relatively sparse. A few haunted fragments of melodies backing some bass-heavy grooves that aren't quite as lush or weird as Kendrick Lamar could be. And in more than a few cases, the mastering is kind of swampy in the low end. Or for cuts like Rich Spirit, you can imagine exactly who might do more with that production. In that case, Vince Staples going for that sort of West Coast vibe. And getting to Kendrick Lamar himself, even when he gets more agitated and forceful, it becomes very obvious just how much of Baby Keem's inflections are really rubbing off on him. And that's definitely a bit of a mixed bag, as Kendrick's own inflections in his voice can sometimes test my patience. And then there's Silent Hill, where for as much as I will have a lot to say about Kodak Black's presence on this album, and you know what, to his credit, by his standards, it's a decent verse that feels at least somewhat thematically connected. This trap beat from Boy Wonder and Soundwave, it sounds cheap, let-in, and clumsily mixed, and any touches of strings, they don't really redeem it. Even before I consider Kodak's verse, it's probably the song that I like the least here, even if it's cliche coming from me. But it's also one reason I kind of want to push back on this being less commercial. The production might be more low-key, but it's not openly challenging or boundary-pushing, and there are songs here that feel like label concessions with slightly less complex lyricism, maybe something of a pop hook. And unfortunately, like the majority of guest verses Kendrick Lamar has put on pop songs, he kind of tends to check out a little bit, so they're not quite as interesting from a content perspective. And honestly, I can't say this album utilizes its length effectively. Yeah, there are some highlights, we will get to them, but for the very even-keeled, mid-tempo vibe of the album over the course of 70 minutes, it can start to feel a little listless, or that certain ideas on some songs can feel a bit redundant as they're repeated. Yes, some of this comes with me being prepared for these themes coming off of Damn, and not having as much patience for them when they're repeated and then expanded on them here, but this is a project that could have easily been trimmed down and streamlined and still gotten the same point across. I think I got the message with Kodak Black's presence the first time. He didn't need more features peppered across the album than anyone else here. And that honestly raises some questions about the guest appearances that we do have. It might be really nice to hear Sampha on the hook of Father Time, definitely an album highlight for me against the reverse samples and the grimy boom bap percussion. I actually think Baby Keem kind of goes off on Savior Interlude, and I'll say it again, Ghostface Killah dropping a verse on Purple Hearts that feels right off of some of the deep cuts of Fish Scale was such a great moment. But why do we have Summer Walker here on that song when you could have had, I don't know, Jhené Aiko instead, whose roots with TDE go back over a decade? Or SZA, who is on the label and does this sound better? Hell, where is the rest of TDE? How many bridges over the past couple of years have been burned that none of them are here? You'd think that for your final album on this label, you'd want some sort of send-off. And you know, I wouldn't even bring this up, criticize the album you have, not the one you want, except for the fact that a lot of this production has a lot of negative space within it, intended to keep the audience meditative, alone with your own thoughts, where you could potentially slot in some verses, play for this context. And as much as Kendrick Lamar wants to highlight the importance of family in his content, who is and isn't included in that family? that's becoming very obvious and revealing. But alright, let's step back for a moment, because again, a lot of cool moments here, even if I don't think they really match Kendrick Lamar's best from any of his albums. Across this project, I like the inclusion of all the tap dancing touches, always emphasizing the performative nature of all of this. Also kind of reminded me a little of Fetch the Bolt Cutters by Fiona Apple from 2020 of all things, something I noticed repeatedly with the emphasis on more spare, jagged piano and percussion. N95's drums might sound kind of canned, same with Mr. Morale. It actively gets distracting for me, even if the vocal arrangement on that song is really nifty. But okay, the oily synth swell in N95 sets up what could be a pretty good banger, even if you get kind of sick of Kendrick Lamar bending his voice like this. I like the hushed bounce on Rich Spirit and Auntie Diaries, especially with that subtle crescendo on the latter, the choral backdrop that switches into the grimy trap of Count Me Out, and some of the tumbling keys behind Worldwide Steppers, Crown, and Savior. They both have this distinctive low-key, roiling knock that I really dug, even as the first one just nails some of the clicking transitions. And I can't deny, I think the album ends, at least in terms of the instrumentals, with a really strong 1-2 punch. The aching piano and strings of Mother I Sober backed up with the hush vocals from Beth Gibbons of Portishead, and the popping percussion and arranged crescendo that drives the closer Mirror. Although, if I'm gonna be real, Alchemist delivers one of the best arrangements in a while that he's had on We Cry Together. That might well be one of the best moments on the entire project. A theatrical back and forth with Taylour Paige depicting a relationship argument that is personal enough to draw blood, but also says plenty about gender dynamics that recalls less Eminem's Kim and more Dave's Both Sides of a Smile. And I can't deny that, despite my frustration with all the percussion inconsistencies here and some of the mastering, this album is reasonably well paced. It feels cohesive and meditative. It sounds therapeutic in a way that suggests enlightenment rather than just getting to a tortured mess, which in theory might lessen some of the dramatic tension, but also gives you the impression that Kendrick Lamar is fully conscious of everywhere he is going to take the audience, every step of the way, or rather, where he's not going to take you. And this is where we have to get to the content. And I want to start off by acknowledging some of the structural conceits, how it seems like the double discs loosely mirror each other, the first being Kendrick Lamar as one of the big steppers in a darker, more deflective lane where some of his vices are in plainer view, where he's more open to be flawed, where the second disc, Mr. Morale, it's more confessional, more introspective, ultimately even a little bit more optimistic in its outlook. If the first disc is denial that he needs therapy at all, the second disc comes with the breakthrough. And again, therapy is really one of the central underpinnings of this project, featuring the presence of one German Dr. Eckhart Tolle, who is a figure of some renown, extolled by Oprah of all people within the whole self-help scene. We'll come back to this specifically later on as well. Now, contrary to some very stupid takes on social media, therapy is not a new or revolutionary concept within rap music. Off the top of my head, Pharoah Monch, Sage Francis, hell, in recent years, Dave with Psychodrama. Those are all projects and artists who have rooted therapy in their confessional storytelling. But Kendrick's not just taking himself to therapy, but his audience, culture at large. This is an album that starts off explicitly confrontational, most immediately on N95, where after an intro where he realized the usual trappings of wealth and hip-hop did not satisfy him, he urges the audience to strip away their own forms of deflection, not just the brands and the flexing, but internet-poisoned irony or their performative idealism. Time to get to where it's messy and complicated, and any attempt at a moral high ground will slip away for everyone. More than ever, he seems to be trying to get to the ugly roots where it's less of a performance, more the complicated reality that audiences really don't want to face about themselves. Get to something real. And by doing so, he exposes some of his own darker impulses and actions. Worldwide Steppers describes how he's fucked white women a couple of times and felt a sense of historical retaliation. Father Time is very open about daddy issues and that same deflection of emotion, stuck within systems of masculinity and capitalism, that when Kendrick Lamar's grandmother died, his father went back to work rather than grieve. And while that system can build an appearance of strength, It weakens something that's deeper within. And then there's the screaming, highly gendered argument of We Cry Together, where for as much as you can tell that both characters are more embodiments of arch points that frequently go past good taste and feel all the more real for it, I do think there's a little bit of irony in how performative and theatrical that song is. It's a bit of a stage play. But hey, Kendrick's always been the first to call himself a hypocrite, right? Well, we'll get back to all that. But first off, the arc of that second disc, the Mr. Morale disc, where the therapy angle snaps into much closer view, and Kendrick Lamar is a lot more confessional than openly confrontational. And the confessions are less to challenge and goad the audience, more to expose. He highlights the cracks in his own ego, the big gaps in his own knowledge, the difficulties he finds in trying to live up to his very high moral standards, and how many of those who have real power that he's met don't even come close to that morality. More just smooth talkers here to enrich themselves or be hypocrites in and of their own right. More to the point, he highlights the generational trauma within parts of the Black community, where he doesn't just wonder aloud about how some of those, to quote The Heart Part 5, hurt people, but also the roots in his own family. Where on Mother I Sober, he questions not just sex addiction on his part that has plagued him for years, but also how his mother had been assaulted, and how her constant worries and questions whether he had his will and been targeted cast a shadow over his younger years. How this is a process and cycle within Black communities. How being sober now, he's forced to confront these past demons head on. But as Eckhart Tolle remarks on Savior Interlude, and I want to quote this directly, if you derive your sense of identity from being a victim, let's say bad things were done to you when you were a child, and you develop a sense of self that's based on the bad things that have happened to you, well, on some level it's not healthy. It's where Kendrick Lamar sees this lingering sickness among Black families, even the culture at large, and where lines like, I can't please everybody, highlights how any savior complex he might have or might have had, it's slipping away. Where the album ends with the telling line, I choose me, I'm sorry. Where for as much as he's placed a mirror up to the audience, he cannot be the one to lead them to change. In that performative conversation of art, he's only the messenger, and to quote him directly, run away from the culture to follow my heart. And sorry I didn't save the world, my friend. I was too busy building mine again. And that's okay. I mean, it's an arc that Kendrick Lamar has been struggling with since at least To Pimp a Butterfly, where the arc of that album was for the Black community at large to try to find a core of self-love that mirrors his own. Go back to a song like I, a good man gradually being crushed under the weight of not being better, and whether it was appropriate or not, he felt the weight of that cause on his shoulders. And if he makes the choice to remove himself from a culture that he doesn't trust to protect his family and his heart, so be it. Who is anyone to judge? He's giving himself that grace for the first time. And this is where a lot of audience have called this album mature, that he's been able to make that choice, move on, think for himself. And yet I don't think I fully agree. Because while this arc might make sense self-contained, dig even a little bit deeper and the cracks start to open up. To start, I feel obliged to mention that I've been in therapy myself before, and more importantly, I've actually done a little bit of work examining the philosophy behind a lot of therapy and self-help. And oftentimes, it's necessarily structured with an individual focus. I mean, if it's dealing with someone's personal trauma or abuse, by necessity, the scope is narrow. It has to encompass you and your struggles and your healing. So is a lot of self-help dogma, and so is a lot of modern Western religion. And on some level, it makes a lot of sense. You can only know and control yourself in your own entirety. You have to put in the work and the self-care. You got to be the one to rise up and live your own life. But the other side of this approach is that it doesn't really deal well with systemic issues. Now, some of this, again, it's by necessity. A therapist on their own is not equipped to tackle systemic racism or capitalism or the historic weight of familial trauma in aggregate for everyone. But the risk that comes with that internalized focus is that it can kind of narrow your view. And for an artist like Kendrick Lamar, who has previously always been acutely aware of those systems of power, that narrowing is very present on this album. I mean, it's understandable. He's been as isolated as we've all been, if not more so, by fame and success. And even if there's a consistent grain of truth that he's often sought the top of the pyramid within modern hip-hop, a leadership role with a view towards maybe something better, it's often just as true that he's often felt unworthy of it. He's been looking for a way to remove himself from that conversation, focus on his own internal journey, find some sense of wellness. But Kendrick Lamar has to know that not everyone has that option. Denzel Curry, highlighted on his album this year, Melt My Eyes, See Your Future, holds a lot of thematic parallels to this project, and he's right, but where both men acknowledged how they might not be the best equipped for leadership, the historical systems of oppression, it's too big for all of them. Denzel Curry still has to live it, accept the darkness within himself, and he's got to keep on walking, even if it might just be the blind leading the blind. Kendrick Lamar can remove himself from the board, in a similar way that Billie Eilish and Lorde have wistfully contemplated doing, but that comes with a certain privilege to have made it thus far within the system already. That's not all just anchored in talent and success and getting there on his own. And this is where we have to get to the Kodak Black of it all, where it becomes very obvious that Kodak Black is not really present on this album for his impressive bars or content, but what he represents specifically within the culture, where Kendrick Lamar has seen Kodak's vices and has actually felt a strong kinship in his darkest moments with him, says that he's even more similar. He openly admits this on Savior. Now I could highlight there are rappers who have similar messy stories surrounding sexual transgressions that might actually have more to say about them and say them better than Kodak Black ever could. Off the top of my head, maybe Freddie Gibbs seems like an inspired choice as a terrific rapper, and of whom I'm quite sure would step up to the challenge and might actually embrace the more emotional complexity. He's done it before on his work, but it's also hard to avoid that Kodak Black's presence strikes this sour note when you have multiple songs that are all about elevating and protecting women around him, and then there's Kodak. And I'm of a few minds of how you can contextualize this contradiction. On the one hand, it can serve to highlight that lingering, messy, moral hypocrisy that Kendrick Lamar wants all of us to confront across the entire album. It's supposed to be uncomfortable, mirroring our own having to live in this reality. And on the other, it could come with the belief, one that's heavily backed by the music industry, that Kodak Black, he's changed, he's repented, and you should forgive and accept his place in the culture. He's gotten better. Something that Kendrick Lamar also has seemed to imply on The Heart Part 5, with how he used the deepfakes in that video to draw attention to where certain people are afforded forgiveness. Now, in the first case, for as much as this album comments on cycles of abuse and then breaking them, seems a little in poor taste to then platform someone who doesn't seem to have broken out of any of it, a struggle that might be reflected in some of Kodak's own content that conspicuously ignores the introspection and apologies that Kendrick himself provides for far lesser transgressions. But I think the larger point of forgiveness kind of runs askew against the reality of how the victim is rarely afforded the same platform or success, or that in execution it comes across like powerful men just protecting their own, and many are all too willing to forgive and grant power simply because they like the art, not caring about the symbolic enablement that it represents. But here's another contradiction. Kendrick, if you want to abdicate the whole savior complex, set aside the crown of thorns, with what moral authority can you then proclaim that some are worthy of forgiveness on your platform, especially when it only serves the systems that you yourself speak against? The nobody's perfect line begins to ring kind of hollow alongside the album where you're on the art, crown of thorns, and your knowledge of what will to power means in the black community. And when you realize that giving up your place within the system deprives you of some of that moral imperative to change and drive that change that you desire, which as much as you claim to be stepping away, you're still exerting presence, whether you like it or not. But then you realize that for as introspective as this album can be, when it starts to look outside of itself, the observations and critiques feel kind of surface level, where based on the evidence of multiple projects and the intricacy of the construction of this double album, you kind of think and hope Kendrick Lamar would know better. For a man who has called out the disingenuous, performative fakes of the music industry to then seem to take the reconciliation of Kanye West and Drake at face value, two men who have built their careers on mirrors of manufactured authenticity, and where I don't believe for a second that this is over, especially as the beef between Drake and Pusha T still lingers, and come on, both these men are petty. I mean, it's a baffling blind spot, as are some of his remarks about COVID-19 on Savior. Then there's the references to cancel culture. I mean, put aside how songs like Rich Spirit highlight how Kendrick Lamar stays offline to remain centered and has mentioned how he goes without a phone for months at a time, how are you in the crosshairs of any Twitter mobs? You have more power to say what that you want on any platform, or are you still bitter over what happened with Humble 5 years ago? Now, from what I can tell, some of the excuses here will be that this is part of the first disc before Kendrick Lamar has found that level of enlightenment in the arc of the album. That Kendrick is focused more on feeling creatively stifled with writer's block within his art, and that's a slightly different conversation than the usual free speech warriors want to make it out to be. That Auntie Diaries serves as a bit of a counterweight to some of that, and how it explores slurs within its arc and tolerance. Or that when you're held up as a moral paragon, it's another layer to be torn back when you find yourself looking to explore the hypocrisy and impossible standards that many creators in these spaces are wind up held to. Hell, I have seen this happen in online spaces where the left wind up eating their own. I viscerally get that sentiment. But I also get how Kendrick Lamar likely might just believe it. Darker impulses be damned. Just because the first disc mirrors the second doesn't mean Kendrick isn't in that mirror, and a lot of similar points they do crop up again on Savior when he's supposed to be enlightened. And I also get how there's a whole audience of folks are going to jump on this point and argument independent of context, and you think that after Fox News smeared All Right disingenuously that Kendrick would be aware that this could happen, especially given his platform. And then there's Auntie Diaries, where even the part of me that's queer can kind of marvel at how Kendrick Lamar traced the line of realization about LGBTQ plus validation in a black family, break away from the misguided views and the slurs of youth in a church rife with its own hypocrisy, where he places family over faith, and gradually, if clumsily, finds some view of acceptance, especially of trans people in 2022, similar to what Frank Turner did on Miranda earlier this year. I would be ignorant to ignore just how kind of daring that is within a mainstream rap album in hip-hop culture, who might not always be as tolerant. But the same side of me knows that if he performs this live, even with the best of intentions, there'll be a whole lot of straight folks repeating those slurs without a thought. And Kendrick knows that too. One of his biggest influences is Eminem. It's not like this hasn't happened before. And yet, I know there's going to be defenders of all of this, that by exposing these transgressive moments that he's helping the audience reach a greater point of enlightenment, if not find God, find more accepting peace within themselves. After all, Kendrick had to put in the work, he went through that arc, and he found that peace. Ironically, then they're placing him right back on the pedestal that he worked so hard to escape. And yet, perhaps maybe he did find some peace. One truth about therapy is that it is a continuous, ongoing process, and we are catching him midway through it, with the intro of Count Me Out highlighting a breakthrough in Session 10, where if you count every disc Kendrick has released in his art, the Mr. Morale disc is indeed number 10. And you know what? Maybe that gain will prove to be enough. I don't suspect we're going to get another Kendrick Lamar album anytime in the near future. And you know what? That's fine too, as he chooses to focus on his family and his kids. He's got that right. But for as many points as this album wants to expose the systems and then cede his position of power within them, convinced that it cannot be changed by him alone and that there's corruption all the way down, I mean, it's most likely true. The logic tracks as to why Kendrick Lamar would believe this and get to this point. But while I have always had a distaste for art that removes itself from the stakes of its own drama, Taylour the Creator did it on Cherry Bomb, Lorde did it on Solar Power, AJR did it multiple times and it made their art excruciating. With Kendrick Lamar, I can't help but feel that it kind of runs at cross purpose to this album's most revealing and powerful moments and messages to the audience, running so hard to the well of relatability, willfully ignoring how so many of his own circumstances in both art and otherwise have decoupled him from that parallel. For as much as Kendrick Lamar is looking to explore familial trauma, sexual abuse, systems and the cultures that perpetuate it, and then social movements that will pay lip service to exposing the problem, put up a black square on Instagram, but never put in the work to fix things, for the answer to feel individualized, with Kendrick Lamar stepping away from it all because he put in the work, now he can, supposedly, disenchanted with collective action because of the messy reality, which in embracing shades of gray you think he would understand, it feels hollow. It lacks populism. And while it's not surprising, the therapeutic self-help angle encourages this framing, as does the continuous lonely religious arc that Kendrick's traced since To Pimp a Butterfly, with the haunted disenchantment with fixing any of it lurking as early as Untitled Unmastered. Even if I'm not the guy to put Kendrick Lamar on a pedestal, it's a disappointment I could not escape with my feelings around this project. And what crystallized it for me, a few passing lines in the final verse of Mirror, which some have interpreted as some long-delayed subs at other rapper No Name's comments about rappers in the wake of protest against police brutality in 2020. Now, his response is better than J. Cole's, not hard, in that he highlights his own vices and failings that have held him back, that he can't be that singular savior, he's choosing his own path, and I'll even give credit to Rich Spirit, where he highlights how he keeps his generosity out of the spotlight, but ultimately, in effect, it can sometimes wind up at the same place. And I wish I wasn't surprised. Because let's be real, the groundwork for this entire album, it's been laid for years now. Beyond the fact that I feel like this is a natural continuation of the paranoia and internal focus of Damn, there are explicit callbacks to Good Kid, Mad City with some of the fictional characters from Auntie Diaries, and the exposure and crisis of hypocrisy it led to some of the strongest moments on To Pimp a Butterfly, my favorite Kendrick song, The Blacker the Berry, where Kendrick Lamar was so strongly tempted by his vices, Lucy, and all that newfound power. It might be one of the biggest reasons why he's choosing to set much of it aside, demolish his own moral authority, highlight his flaws and failings, and present the man, not the myth, even if in truth he's kind of been doing it for years. And for those who place Kendrick on a pedestal because of his art, that might be a tough pill to swallow, especially when decoding all the fine details can be far from flattering in terms of what it tells of Kendrick the man. But intentionally narrowing the scope with the self-help framing, taking a shallower view to its systemic critiques and not commenting on how his own choices will cascade into all of it, seemingly unwilling to delve into how he built some of his own mythology to get to this point, alongside choices in guest stars, production, and compositions that might all make sense but feel kind of uneven and flat in their execution. It's not an album I like nor respect as much as I want to. But as someone who believes that outside of maybe Good Kid, Mad City, that Kendrick Lamar has not had the best rap album of any year that he's dropped, to me this is just revealing in ways that don't surprise me. They feel depressingly conventional, but maybe that's actually an asset? No, I don't think this album is particularly challenging or transgressive from where I'm at, but I also know to an audience for whom Kendrick Lamar is the deepest rap music they'll listen to in a year, hell, the deepest music they'll hear in a year, this will probably push them. And there's value in that broader scope, especially around familial drama, trauma, mental health, therapy, especially in masculine circles. Again, for as much as I have complicated issues with this project, it is still good enough in ambition and execution to spur conversations around those issues, and even if, again, if he's not leading the conversations, the fact they're starting has value. So maybe it's more of a gateway. There'll be those like me who will wish that more would go through that gateway all the way, find something more stirring, hit that moral fiber. But if Kendrick's chosen to take up occupancy alongside that gate, provide even just a bit of a nudge, even if plenty just wind up sitting at his feet and going no further, if one keeps walking, that's going to be a big step. And that's what counts. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Yes, I know this review went on way too long and went on a lot of tangents and got kind of philosophical and tangled, and I probably said plenty of things that pissed y'all off. That's what the comments are for, have fun. But beyond that, again, I can imagine this is just going to be a kind of a complicated thing to parse all the way through. I understand if I may have push things into territory that not everyone is there. I get how this album has value. I'm not going to take that away from any of you, but to me, I don't know. I feel like it is a culmination, but it's a culmination to a point I wish it didn't have to go. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in supporting the channel, getting albums on my schedule, hell, just arguing with me directly about this album on my Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand, but options are available. Also, if you want to buy merch to support the channel, that option is down in the description below. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.